We are in communication with doctors from all around the world, and we are in possession of an enormous amount of evidence in regard to the issue, not just about hydroxychloroquine, it must be said, but treatments generally for the early treatments. We're talking about early outpatient treatments of this virus. The evidence for it is extraordinary. The people who have advised the governments, we are concerned, have not really taken into consideration all of the available evidence, and have advised the government in a way that we would consider to be somewhat ill-informed. And therefore, there's a certain level of accountability that needs to be considered for those that have made these decisions, and the impacts that the treatments may have had for those who have either succumbed or been affected by this virus. So in a sense, what we have experienced has been a very dangerous, extreme public health experiment, which has failed and has caused untold harm and suffering in our community. And it goes against and it contravenes the idea of the first do no harm. But I can tell you that what's been happening in Australia is that we have the evidence that at the level of the Australian Bureau of Statistics, they've changed the definition of a death in relation to COVID, specifically in relation to COVID, to include those that die with it. So it doesn't matter whether you've got cancer, stage 4 cancer, and you contract this illness and you're not affected by this, you can be put down as a COVID death. So the statistics on this really need to be examined and opened up. And the Irish situation, just to give you an example, when Dr Cahill was examining this and getting a team of doctors and lawyers to pursue all of the death certificates through the coroners, was that the official rate, I believe, was 1,700 deaths in Ireland from COVID. When they examined this closely, the number came down to less than 100 of people who had died from the virus itself.
So welcome to Frank Talk. I'm Albert Ladon, your host today. I have with me Dr Eamonn Mathieson. Welcome, Eamonn.
Thank you, Albert.
And Eamonn, may I ask you to introduce yourself briefly to our audience?
Sure. My name's Eamonn Mathieson. I'm an anaesthetist. I work in public and private settings in Melbourne, in Victoria, Australia. I am one of the conveners of a doctors group, an ad hoc doctors group that began by writing a letter to the Premier of Victoria to alert him as to the concerns that we doctors have and were seeing in regard to the harms of the lockdowns. As a consequence of that letter, there's been a significant amount of energy that's followed from this, and a great deal of support that we've received from many other doctors, between 500 and 1,000 doctors now in Victoria and across Australia, supporting our concerns, as well as a great deal of support from the general public about our position and raising concerns about the lockdowns. Otherwise, I'm married to my wife Nicole and have 3 teenage children that otherwise keep me busy when I'm not pursuing these issues of concern for the public health in Victoria.
So from a scientific background, can you tell us a little bit about your studies and what you have you done in terms of science?
Well, I studied medical school at Monash University here in Victoria. I subsequently trained as a doctor, a medical doctor, both here and in various countries around the world, including the United Kingdom, at doing rotations and anaesthetic positions there in Addenbrooke's and University East London. So I did my fellowship in anaesthesia in 2002, and so I've been an anaesthetic consultant for now 18 years. I have a particular interest in bioethics over that period of time, and have studied in in that area as well. So yeah, that's my background, basically a working anaesthetist with an interest in bioethics.
How do you understand the consequence of the lockdown?
Well, it's from what we see, both in our family with friends, of seeing the impacts of the lockdowns, from communicating with the medical community here in Melbourne and Victoria, speaking to many of my colleagues across a range of specialties. With anesthesia, we tend to sort of mix with a range of specialties, including, surgeons, as well as psychiatrists. I do an ECT list. We liaise with many friends with general practitioners. So I get a fairly broad range of inputs across a range of specialties about what they are seeing and what they're experiencing in their patients and generally in the community. As a result, I have, a lot of contacts in the medical community. We have lots of discussions, and the initial letter was simply a group of friends and colleagues, 12 who were doctors who were concerned enough to write a letter. We were waiting for other people to do it, and we were sort of surprised about the uniform nature and the lack of dissent amongst the medical community about some of the measures being taken in regard to the public health measures and policies. And so, we were waiting for a long time, and there was a decision coming up in the Parliament to extend the state of emergency powers beyond the 6 months. And it was talked about the possibility of it being extended to 18 months. And so over the weekend prior to that decision, a few of us liaised with one another, and we fairly rapidly put a letter together with some details about the harms and also the comparisons and the nature of the virulence of the condition from what we had understood. I'd been following it very closely for many months and liaising with other colleagues. And we just wanted to put it down in paper and to say that, that the opinion of the medical community was not uniform. There was no absolute consensus. We knew that from discussions, in the tea rooms and amongst ourselves, that there was not this, consensus that was portrayed by the authorities and by the hierarchies of the medical community.
So I remember very well the weekend you're talking about because it was a great moment of anxiety for all of us when we saw the Premier of the state basically seizing power and wanting to continue the lockdown nearly indefinitely, but certainly for 12 extra months plus. And that's, I think in the end, he got 6 months. That's what the upper house afforded him. But it can be open-ended because the same people in the upper house that voted for an extra 6 months could give him a month at the time going forward. There are 3 seats there that he's got in his pocket, basically. So from a democratic viewpoint, I find the state we're in quite incredible because it is at his discretion whether the parliament can sit, and when the parliament sits, it's usually to pass legislation that he wants to pass. I believe that the last one that he tried to pass, which was called the Omnibus Bill, where he wanted to empower anyone that he would nominate to arrest people on discretionary basis and detain them without trial. That was defeated because I do know there was a lot of dissent in the federal Labour Party on that bill, and there was an enormous pressure coming directly from the leadership of the Labour Party. But there's still some elements in that bill that are questionable, such as giving himself and the ministers some immunity beyond this pandemic. I think that fascinates me. But let's go back to your profession. So your profession has always been regulated. It's fair to say. You've got, in Australia, you've got what, the TGA, I think is called. So it's not like doctors in this country are free to do whatever they want at any point in time. You've got very heavy regulations. You've got, of course, a sermon that you go through when you first graduate, le sermon d'Hippocrate, the Hippocratic Oath in English. And I think you abide by that first and foremost. The Hippocratic Oath comes before the TGA orders or after?
Well, it's interesting, the history of the Hippocratic Oath, and also the fact that many medical schools no longer profess that. This is not something that we graduate saying or committing to. So the Hippocratic Oath came under considerable pressure to be removed from medical schools in the sort of latter half of the 20th century. So I think to a great shame in many ways. But there are...
Has it been taken out now?
That's right. Yes. So there's no formal. There's a common understanding that there's a formal oath that we recite. That's just not. That has not been the case for quite some time.
I did not know that. I'm actually flabbergasted to hear this.
I would like to say that there are other principles beyond the rules of, it's not necessarily the TGA, that's regarding therapeutic and goods administration. I'm talking about the medical boards. There's APRA, which is the Health Professionals Registration Agency, and they have guides of good medical practice. But the other thing that we do abide by are certain basic principles of medicine and medical practice, which we would argue have been in some ways undermined or contravened by the policies that have been implemented. Now, what's really important to know is that we do commit to various covenants of human rights, for example, the International and Civil and Political Rights Covenant, of which under that there is a series of principles that guide public health restrictions. In our letter on our website, the covidmedicalnetwork.com website, our statement or our sort of more refined letter refers to the series of principles, of which we believe the authorities and those advising in regard to public policies have contravened. There are other areas that that guide our practice, and I think the issue of first do no harm is part of the understanding, if not the oath taken by Hippocratic Oath, and it determines everything that we really do in terms of deciding whether medication should be utilized. An experimental medication, for example, can be utilized to treat a condition. If it causes more harm than the condition, it's not rendered legal, it's not utilized, etc. And it should be the same sort of standards should apply to public health policy. And in fact, they do, because the World Health Organization just in 2019 published its document regarding the non-pharmaceutical interventions for public health, and it recommended various things that should and shouldn't be done. And this is just in 2019. So this is just before this SARS-CoV-2 corona phenomenon occurred. And what's interesting is that they have degrees of pandemics from, mild, moderate, severe to extraordinary. And even at the level of extraordinary, it says that under no circumstances should their lockdowns be used. They also specify other measures that should never be used in any circumstances. And this is a document only last year that guided public health policy and has always guided public health policy. And yet this year, governments around the world, particularly our government in Victoria, have contravened this, have gone against this wisdom, this accumulated wisdom about how to manage pandemics and public health, and have implemented these. We don't know why. We don't know on what basis this has been done. And the reason that they have warned against using them in the past, right up until several months ago, is that they recognize the harms that can be done by these lockdowns. They knew this. And we are witnessing that. And so in a sense, what we have experienced has been a very dangerous, extreme public health experiment, which has failed and has caused untold harm and suffering in our community. And it goes against and it contravenes the idea of the first do no harm. And the doctors who are advising this, we would question, in a sense, who they are. We know who they are. What evidence of which they're basing this? Why are they doing it? For what objectives? Why are they choosing to take this experimental path against all of the evidence that we are raising and showing to them, that the harms that is causing in the community? And they are myriad. They're impacting every other medical condition. It's a fixation error to consider this one condition of the effects of the virus above all other things, and to turn on its head the entire history of how you manage public health and pandemics. It really is quite extraordinary, and it's difficult to fathom the thinking and the reasoning behind it.
Yes, I mean, there are many areas that are seriously questionable. For instance, this entire campaign against hydroxychloroquine. Now, if I said that word, there is an MP called Craig Kelly who made a speech in Parliament House on the 19th of October. You can look it up. And he said something very interesting. He said the mere pronouncing of the word hydroxychloroquine makes some people frothing at their mouth. And so this has become so irrational. Yet, I was talking about a TPG before, has put a total ban on it. And you've got, I'm sure, evidence that hydroxychloroquine does work.
Well, I think there's a considerable amount of evidence to support it. And the history behind how this has transpired is very interesting and will be revealed. We are in communication with doctors from all around the world, and we are in possession of an enormous amount of evidence in regard to the issue, not just about hydroxychloroquine, it must be said, but treatments generally. For the early treatments, we're talking about early outpatient treatments of this virus. The evidence for it is extraordinary. The people who have advised the governments, we are concerned, have not really taken into consideration all of the available evidence, and have advised the government in a way that we would consider to be somewhat ill-informed. And therefore, there's a certain level of accountability that needs to be considered for those that have made these decisions, and the impacts that the treatments may have had for those who have either succumbed or been affected by this virus. So that's something that needs to be addressed. Now, it's not only hydroxychloroquine, it is other ionophores, including ivermectin, which is being used very effectively with triple therapy, with zinc and zithromycin. These protocols are being used around the world and shown to be extraordinarily effective in impacting mortality and morbidity. And these issues just need to be raised with the proper authorities and in the public sphere. There are people like Peter McCulloch, who in the US, who has devised and offered to the world very well evidenced and well researched protocols for treating outpatient patients affected by COVID. And we would like to bring to the attention to those who have made decisions otherwise that there is this evidence out there. But part of the problem is a lack of openness to peer review and criticism, and this was something that our network of doctors are hoping to rectify.
I want to give you an economic argument. I just want to have your take on this, and then we'll deep down into the tools that the Victorian government has been utilizing. But hydroxychloroquine is very cheap. It's a medicine that's been around for a long time. I think Australia approved hydroxychloroquine in 1955. So millions of people have used it and are using it on a yearly basis. It costs, I think, 5 to 10 cents per pill. It's a medicine that is totally out of copyright, out of patent, basically. So there's no problem in utilizing it. You've got new medicine that are actually proven to be more toxic than the hydroxychloroquine. I'm thinking about the one in particular from Gilead.
Remdesivir, yeah. They're very expensive.
$1,000 in Australia per injectable. So there is an economic argument here, of course. It's been proven in France, there's a parliamentary inquiry in France about the advice received by so-called experts that are giving the advice to governments as to the extent of their conflict of interest. Do you think there is something like that going on here in Australia?
Yeah, it's difficult to know the motives really behind people's decision making. A lot of people have speculated about that issue that you raise. Many doctors have raised that with myself. I think it just requires, as you say, very close scrutiny from a legal perspective to follow that down. I think when things don't make a lot of sense, there's that old principle of, follow the money. That is a grave concern, particularly when you know the evidence, you look at the evidence and you wonder why there's decisions being made against that. And then you know the economic arguments as well. You would think that governments would be preferring to go for the effective and cheaper option, but obviously there are vested interests that would prefer an alternative to that.
Yes. So in Victoria in particular, the medical advice that is provided to the Premier comes from Mr. Sutton, the Chief Medical Officer.
But he's actually the Chief Health Officer, which is technically different to the Chief Medical Officer. They're two separate roles. So,
is there a Chief Medical Officer in Victoria?
Sorry?
Is there a Chief Medical Officer in Victoria?
Yes, there is. And his name has slipped my mind. It's interesting that he's very not in the public eye, but there is a technical difference between Chief Health Officer and Chief Medical Officer, and the Chief Health Officer is Brett Sutton, and it appears that he has been the one who has been giving the advice to the Premier and the Health Minister, etc. Andrew Wilson, it's come back to me, is the Chief Medical Officer in Australia, in Victoria. Yeah. So part of the problem, which is one of the issues that we have challenged, that goes against the issues or the practice of good medicine and the principles that support it, is that openness and transparency. We still don't really know who it is that is advising. It's not very clear, other than Brett Sutton, who is the lead Chief Health Officer, but who is advising him to be across the evidence and giving the advice for these measures and policies, and on which they are basing those decisions and that advice. It's still not clear. They are not making it public, the evidence on which these things have been decided. At the moment, as you know, there's a Supreme Court case challenging the issue of curfews. And the evidence on which supports that from a public health perspective. And we know that Dr. Michelle Giles was the person that signed off on this. She's an infectious disease doctor, and she has laid claim to advising on this on medical and health grounds. We would challenge that and would like to look at the evidence for that. And I think that people like Michelle and other doctors who can be identified should be held accountable for those decisions and for the impacts that they have and the consequences of them. And so what we have been calling for from the very start is an openness to the evidence so that it can be undergo proper scrutiny and peer review and be challenged, which is how medicine and science should be done. It should not be done behind a veil of obscurity.
And yet the Premier is very quick to say that he's following the science. This is politicization.
What science, though, Albert? What science? Like, who? The experts from around the world that is calling for an end to lockdowns immediately. David Nabarro from the World Health Organization, the special envoy to the Director General there. Professors Gupta and others who wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, the people at the Evidence-Based Medicine Centre in Oxford, Carl Hennigan and others. Which experts and which science is he following? Like, this is the question. The science.
It's the picking and choosing of the science that suits his political agenda. That has to be the answer.
But this is the real concern, because the noble professions, perhaps once noble professions of medicine and science, are really being led into disrepute in the leaders within those communities and those professions, allowing for medicine and science to be potentially used for political purposes. This is a great concern, and this is without the transparency and openness, people can make these conjectures, and it looks really of considerable concern.
So let me ask you, we often hear the Premier referring to the number of cases today and so on. What is a case?
It's a very good question, Albert. I'm surprised that no journalists have asked that question for the last 6 months. I'm still not clear what a case is. I know that referring to cases goes against the whole tradition or the history of medicine in referring to the difference between someone who tests positive to a test, particularly a PCR test, someone who is ill as a result of that positive test, whether someone has an infection, whether they're a carrier of a virus or viral tissue, and it's necessary to differentiate between these things. If you're a case and you are asymptomatic and you're not infectious, are you a case? The complete lack of clarity is a great concern, and it's really, in a sense, doctors who are paying attention to this find it quite laughable. That the entire population is essentially being misled or misinformed by numbers and terminology like cases that imply a certain level of infectiousness in the community, a certain level of problem, but it's not. It's simply based upon, I think, people joining the dots in their own minds and coming up to conclusions that aren't based upon the reality of the word case and what the case is based on. As you say, a positive test, and then it raises the question about the test and what that means, and it exposes further the lack of good information that's given to the public so that they can understand the realities of what is happening as a result of the SARS-CoV-2 virus.
So what is a PCR test, for instance? And what's the science behind it?
It's a polymerase chain reaction test that can search for any particular molecule in the body or a set of molecules. It's more what is the issue with the test. The test is fine in what it does, but it can easily, I think, be misconstrued or misused. So my understanding is that, and this is coming off the Department of Health website, that the test doesn't differentiate between a live virus and an unlive virus, and it is not a sign or an indicator of infectivity, because it depends on viral loads, and it depends on whether there's just fragments of the viral sequence that are being detected. And it depends on the cycling of how many times you cycle something. The test, as you know,
the cycle threshold. It's like a zoom. The more cycles, the zooming in is greater than if you were to do less. So there is a balance. You need to find a number of cycles that will give you the less possible amount of false positive. That's what it's about.
That's right. And so we've actually tried to inquire what sort of cycle ratios they're using both here and around the world. And that evidence is not really forthcoming. The inventor of the PCR tests was saying that any molecule in the human body can be, detected if it's ramped up enough by any of the PCR tests. So there's a lack of clarity about this, but there's also a lack of understanding about what a positive test means to a PCR test. And we have the authorities of the DHHS and the Department of Health saying that this test is not differentiate between a live and an unlive virus, which means that if you test positive, you may not be infected. But if you test positive, you're put into quarantine, and all the people around you as well. If it's not a sign of infectivity, as the DHHS has said, then the test can't be used as a means of, contacting exposed patients or putting people into quarantine. So the test, it seems, the entire regime of how we're managing this SARS-CoV-2 virus is based upon this test. And we've done, I think now, almost 8,400,000 tests in a population of 25 million, of which there has been, on average, I think, a 0.4% positive rate. And so when you look at it just mathematically, the problem with that, of screening entire populations with a PCR test, which is not designed for showing infectivity or contagiousness, is a profound problem. And I think that the public needs to be aware of that. I think the people who are organizing the tests and running the regime based upon that test need to explain why they are doing this. They need to explain why it is that the TGA has never recommended or has said that asymptomatic population screening with this PCR test is not recommended, and that there are profound problems with this. These are very serious questions, because without understanding that the issue and the problems with that PCR test, you can run this regime based upon the numbers each day. And going back to the numbers, Albert, just one last thing. In relation to the legislation and the basis for locking us down and for continuing the state of emergency and state of disaster, in the legislation that was amended that weekend, or in that weekend that you recall earlier in the interview, the terminology that's written into the legislation is that they have given themselves power to continue these lockdowns and state of emergencies, even when there is low transmission of the virus in the community, and even with, this is a quote, 0 cases for a period of time. 0 cases. So the PCR test, even when you're testing every person population screening, even when you find nothing with this PCR test, which, as you know, all you have to do is ramp up the cycles and you'll find something. You'll find some remnants of a coronavirus and the sequencing of it. Even when there are 0 cases for a period of time, the period of time is not even specified. This gives them the power to continue this. That was the most alarming thing that I found in that legislation, which really prompted us to say, this is, insanity. What about healthcare?
It's beyond medicine. Now we are in a completely different realm. It's called totalitarianism. We've seen totalitarian regimes before, and we're falling into that. One more thing. Yesterday we had 2 cases. One of the 2 cases, the Premier said, is a relapse. Is someone that tested positive in July. We're treating him as a relapsed case, he said. He may not have used the word relapsed, but he said something absolutely to that effect. So this would be a first. But also, given what you said about the PCR test and the cycle thresholds, the more cycles, the more likelihood of finding dead virus and therefore having false positives. Treating him as a new case is only a precursor to say, oh yes, all of you, because there are thousands of people who had the coronavirus now in the state, even though you had the coronavirus and you think you can get it, well, you're going to have to continue to wear masks, you're going to have to continue to be in lockdown, you're going to have to be treated as though you never had the coronavirus before. That's what he's getting at. And that's where we are in territory now, where we think we're in lockdowns as prisoners.
Yeah, just on that the PCR testing, the delayed positive test. So we have it from communications from the DHHS that the PCR test, if you test positive in January, you will test positive not at 14 days, 28 days, but several months later. So, so they're kind of caught in a way, because what that implies is that the positive test is not a sign of infectivity. So if you've completely recovered and you are asymptomatic and you're still testing positive because you have a carrier of the dead virus months later, you test positive, but it's not a sign of infectivity. So they actually stopped the protocol of testing some of the nursing home patients because they realized that if they test them a month later and 2 months later, they were still getting positive, but they knew that they weren't infective. So it sort of exposes the reality of the test. But it also can be used to say, oh, they get reinfected, which, as you say, is just unheard of. And the other aspect of it is that if you are asymptomatic, this is the other part of the narrative, is that if you're asymptomatic and you test positive, that somehow you are infective. But the test does not indicate infectivity necessarily, and it doesn't differentiate between live and unlive viruses. But this notion that a respiratory virus, an influenza-like illness virus, that you can be contagious even when you're asymptomatic is unprecedented. This is not part of, a historical understanding of virology. So all of these aspects, which, as you say, don't appear to be scientific in any way, but are useful for a narrative to continue. But the scientific community really should be standing up and, expressing grave concerns about how science is being manipulated in this way. But they are not, and this is a great concern. This is coming back to when we wrote the letter. We didn't know whether we would be applauded or, or ridiculed for doing this, because it was very uncomfortable stepping out into a potential maelstrom. We didn't know if it would be positively received or not, because there is a sense of keeping quiet and not speaking out. And many doctors have contacted us subsequently and said, that we were brave in doing it, which is very strange, to simply state something that is bleedingly obvious to the vast majority of health professionals about the harms that they are seeing. It seems extraordinary that that's considered a brave act in this day and age, and the fact that so many doctors have contacted us, encouraging us and supporting us, but not wanting to put their names to any documents or evidence that they give us. It shows a culture that is really unhealthy within the medical and scientific community.
You have taken a stand with your friends. You've created a group. So tell us about that.
Yeah, well, as a result of the overwhelmingly positive response, and we sort of felt a bit of responsibility to sort of continue it beyond just writing a letter and going back to work. And as a result, we put together a website. We are still in the process of organizing the support and the resources that have been offered to us. We are still in the process of building the website to basically present the information and the evidence that we are in possession of, and we think that we should share that, and in the way that medicine and science is meant to be done, and in contradistinction to what we are challenging and criticizing about the way it's been operated by the government and its advisors. So we are still very much in the process of that. It takes time to do that outside of the normal sort of work and family, but we have been given administrative and some media support, which we're very grateful for. So we've basically got a page that the doctors can sign up and show their support. We're still collecting doctors every day who are joining with us.
How many members do you have so far?
Oh, I was going to get that count before we started. We'd be probably up to somewhere around 600-700 now, I would imagine. We're hoping to get to 1,000, hopefully with the proper sort of PR. We think that we could easily get to 1,000. We know that there's thousands of doctors who around Australia who are challenging this narrative and starting to see things more clearly. So with the proper sort of promotion, hopefully we'll get to 1,000, and then maybe we'll write another letter back to Daniel Andrews, and maybe he might respond that time. The other thing is not, we opened it up because there were requests from other health professionals, nurses, psychologists, etc., to join with us, and we've been getting extraordinary support from them and stories about what they're experiencing, and it's really quite extraordinary. And also from the general public, we've asked for them to tell their stories so that we can publish them, so that it's not hidden. Part of the idea, I think, of the isolation where everyone's in their own house is that we don't get to sort of that normal sort of social experience of sharing our concerns with family and friends. And we thought that quite by accident initially with the original website, we were surprised by the inundation with stories from the just from the general public who saw that this, was an avenue to express their concerns. So that's another thing that's going on. And as a result of this sort of, coalescing of this ad hoc group of doctors, we're in communication now with the various groups of doctors around the world, including, the doctors from the UK and the US doctors who just had their second summit in Washington just over the last weekend. So that gives us a lot of succor and a reassurance and encouragement. So we're sort of, we're not an organized professional group, but we're trying to do our bit, and we are going to be looking to all the doctors to give us perhaps some financial support over the weekend, because the PR people and the social media, there's a couple of social media women who are helping us. We can't be continued on for the next few months or weeks, however long it's going to take for some of the truth to come out, for them to continue to do that in a pro bono fashion. So so it's a work in progress, and we're hoping that we can play our part for getting some of the story out there to the public. And
Eamonn, I think that you're playing a bigger role than what you think. Firstly, at the moment, anytime someone that is not a doctor, some member of the public, business or whatever, when we come out to speak against what Andrew does, we are immediately shut down by saying that we are conspiracy theorists. And so it's very difficult when you're not from the medical profession to defend the point of view that you are defending. But now, you guys coming out, you are going to even give political leaders that have not been able to take your viewpoint, even though they can see something really nefarious going on. But by an independent group of doctors like yourself, growing as you are, and more medical practitioners coming on joining your group, you are providing that voice, the alternative voice that is unheard. And that's giving me courage, and I'm sure it's going to give a lot of other people, especially the political powers of this country, the courage to stand up against this moronic approach to groupthink and believing whatever the Premier says, and it is enough.
Well, it is interesting, Albert, that right at the beginning, we kept being told, of people that I spoke to, whether it was journalists, people in the media, and some politicians who were saying all the right things. I mean, they were questioning things and questioning the science and the medicine. But as you say, it could just be batted away. Even the lawyers presenting their opinions on things, it could be batted away, and their answer was simply, listen to this doctor in a white coat. And that was it. And even the best arguments, even the best evidence could be batted away by like this. So we were quite conscious of the fact that what was required was that sort of, the medical vanguard, tip of the spear, to actually challenge that. And so it was just a matter of, getting a few people together willing to sort of step into that and to sort of basically assist all of the other people who are making all the right arguments and understanding it very well. Because of the realities.
There are some key phrases that the PC police is using. One of them is, we're doing this to save lives. It's a lie. And the other phrase is, we listen to the medical advice. And we also know that that's a lie. But what they are designing to do is to simply stop people thinking. And while you stop thinking, they get to do whatever their agenda is, they get to implement it. And then by the time you wake up, it's too late. I hope it's not too late, but let me tell you, the destruction that this has caused to the state of Victoria, the devastation, the economic devastation is beyond the pale. It's absolutely criminal to having a state like Victoria that was doing so well economically and to take it and to actually devastate it on the basis of what has been going on. I totally, by the way, I can accept, I'm sure you do too, that in the beginning when things were very unknown and things needed to be explored, that you would take a very cautious approach to things. I can totally understand where the Prime Minister and Josh were coming from at the beginning. They wanted to see things, they wanted to protect people. They did not know.
I think so. I think you're right about the initial response. I think it's like when anything, it's just a human response. The other area that I have an interest in can give some insights into it is that if something comes in hot and fast, we tend to do a startle response. If you ever see a broken bat going into a crowd in a baseball game, everyone throws their arms up in exactly the same way. It's a sort of a startle response that when something, coming in to you that looks like it could do you harm, it's almost a sort of a subconscious reaction. And I think that's what we saw at the start of the year when we saw something going on that was coming really in that looked dangerous, and there was a certain reflex response, and it's understandable. And that response usually is an overreaction, and that's what we saw. As you say, it's understandable, but the startle response should only last a certain period of time, that reflex sort of thing. Then it's a matter of then assessing the threat, assessing the situation and responding from that. But the continuation of that fear-based startle response has been, as you say, incredibly harmful, but and it seems to have been utilized for perhaps other purposes that aren't specifically about the virus or health or medicine or science. And it is a great, that is the great concern.
So, Eamonn, what would you say to those doctors and nurses to convince them to join your group?
Look around, pay attention, read. Don't necessarily watch the TV news that is presenting one particular side of the story. I think part of the problem of the lack of thinking that you described is the fact that there is that happens when people are acting emotionally or out of fear, and I think that there needs to be a sort of a message of reassurance and as well as hope, which is what good medical practice is meant to be about. But the doctors should take that on board themselves. I think in order to quell that level of fear, I think you need to have an understanding of reality. Most of those sort of exaggerated anxieties and fears are often based upon things that don't accord with reality. And one of the strategies is simply to calmly assess things as they are. And that requires doing some, not being lazy, doing some research, visiting our website. Hopefully soon all the evidence or a lot of the evidence will be up there that they can sift through it and make.
What is your website address, please?
Well, it's covidmedicalnetwork.com. And we'll have links to there's some excellent websites around the world that have been propping up. We'll have all of the links there that are potentially hard to find because they're probably slightly outside the mainstream of health, the healthcare channels. We're tracking our way up. I think we're almost on the first page of Google now if you search for it. But we understand that there has been considerable issues with getting a different message out across the internet with various censorship campaigns towards the doctors. And One of them, just interestingly enough, they were using the World Health Organization's position recently to block anyone who was challenging what was going on. But now the World Health Organization is saying that lockdowns should cease immediately. I wonder if the internet gatekeepers will shut down all of the government sites that are predicting or suggesting that they should continue. It would be interesting to see if their censorship works the other way, because they're going against what the World Health Organization is saying to do.
You know, one of the search engines that I'm promoting that is absolutely independent and people can find all the information they want. I'm finding things that is extraordinary. When I'm looking for something now, that's my go-to search engine. It's called daxdac.com, yes. And it's perfect. You find all the links you want there. There's no censorship.
Links are on the website to the Facebook and things like that. In fact, when we set up the original, set up the original Facebook, I think we had the word COVID in it. It lasted about 3 minutes and it was taken down by Facebook. So we changed it to the acronym of CMN.
So, Eamonn, is there anything else that you would like to cover which we have not covered?
Well, perhaps one other thing that people need to be aware of, which is another one of the issues that we'll be revealing on the COVID Medical Network website, is the issues of deaths. When you were talking about deaths, we're saving lives, and what that actually means, and to drill down on that. So it's very important to understand the difference between someone dying with COVID and someone dying from COVID. Now, the evidence from around the world and the research is quite extraordinary about this, particularly the work of Dr. Dolores Cahill in Ireland. But I can tell you that what's been happening in Australia is that we have the evidence that at the level of the Australian Bureau of Statistics, they've changed the definition of a death in relation to COVID, specifically in relation to COVID, to include those that die with it. So it doesn't matter whether you've got cancer, stage 4 cancer, and you contract this illness and you're not affected by this, you can be put down as a COVID death. So the statistics on this really need to be examined and opened up, and there needs to be an inquiry into this. So we know that we've joined the dots as to who has been responsible for changing this, what their connections are, and why they've done this, and why they've done this all around the world. The Irish situation, just to give you an example, when Dr. Cahill was examining this and getting a team of doctors and lawyers to pursue all of the death certificates through the coroners, was that the official rate, I believe, was 1,700 deaths in Ireland from COVID. When they examined this closely, the number came down to less than 100 of people who had died from the virus itself. So this is a great scandal. And this needs to be examined very closely by the proper authorities and a proper inquiry, because never before in medicine would someone who has a heart attack, who happens to have a cold, be told that the death certificate should say that they've died from that cold. This is just extraordinary manipulation of very serious statistics at the level of the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Now, I think that this is just astonishing. And you combine the change in definition of deaths with the PCR testing to create the notion of cases. You have an ability then to manipulate the narrative for the population, to put them in a state of fear, to achieve the lack of thinking, as you say, but also the certain political ends or whatever ends that you're wanting to achieve. Because as you say, it goes beyond medicine and science when you're talking about those sort of measures.
Eamonn, what you're saying is extraordinary. I hope there will be a royal commission in Australia, and I hope that the political class is going to wake up and get us out of this. It's just, I can't think that we are in Australia, because what you're describing is a kind of manipulation that you would expect in the former Soviet Union. I'm not even sure whether in the current Russia they would allow these sort of things. It's quite incredible.
And I think there needs to be an accountability to the people who've facilitated this or have stayed silent and known about this, and those that have recommended these things, particularly in the medical profession, who have, as you said at the beginning, I think a higher duty, a higher responsibility, both to their codes of ethics as well as to the community. And there should be, as I think Janet Albrechtsen wrote, a reckoning at some stage when this is all revealed.
I think that's exactly what is required, a reckoning. Eamonn, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for being so courageous and for bringing to us the tools that will enable us and many of our friends to expose what is going on. I really thank you.
Thanks very much, Albert. It's great to chat with you. Thank you.